Welcome, everybody. It's the Montana World Affairs Council on the radio. Peter Christian, of course, John King over there. Good morning, John.
Good morning, Peter.
Bob Seidenschwartz has already shared his august wisdom.
And now in my official position, representing the Montana World Affairs Council, cut the puns out with this guy, okay? Let's just get right to business, guys. We've got a very august guest, not a June Bob, so let's get our guest here.
All right. And his name is Job Henning, and Job is a lawyer, a strategist, and a technology entrepreneur. He was at the Energy Conference recently.
Job was here in Montana as part of one of our panelists for the Mansfield Center Conference.
He's a partner at Grid Energy, a smart grid services and renewable energy company. Grid Energy's LinkPad product provides last-mile smart grid integration for residential users. He was a co-founder of Open Revolution, a mobile payments and digital commerce company that builds and operates payment and loyalty products and partners with microfinance institutions and development organizations to expand access to finance throughout Latin America, Africa, and South Asia. Mr. Henning was a senior fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency, where he worked on the Pete Peterson Security America's Future Initiative, a project on national competitiveness and infrastructural investment strategy. And I did not pre-read this. He served as a co-director of the Congressionally Chartered Commission, the Project on National Security Reform, wow, where he worked on economic development and climate change. So on and on and on we go.
I heard all that, and Job, I still have no idea what you do.
Well, good to be with you, gentlemen. I've done a number of things. Should have warned you about the long bio there, but I think I'm here to talk about energy today, and I'm speaking to you in my capacity at Grid Energy, a smart grid services company based in Baltimore, Maryland.
So, Job, I'm going to read, this comes right from, I believe, your website on Grid Energy. I'm going to read this opening paragraph and then let that kind of serve as a platform for a multitude of different ways we can have a discussion about this. The rapid evolution of the smart grid and competitive energy markets is creating a new set of opportunities and risks for energy users throughout the United States. The Grid Energy team helps companies navigate through the environment and make proactive decisions that directly impact the bottom line immediately and over the long term. So just taking the phrase creating opportunities but also issues, give us a little bit of insight and understanding of what is actually happening out there. Most of us tend to understand energy distribution in the traditional way. The big utilities, you have the system in place, the wires, it goes out, you turn your furnace, your electric usage on. So what is happening in the world right now that we as the public need to start to understand, and of course, what's some of the impacts, both pro and con here?
Okay, yeah, well, certainly. Well, thanks for the invitation to talk about all that. Well, basically, Bob, you have our traditional approach to power and the regulation of power stemming from the 1930s in the heart of the Great Depression with the Federal Power Act, 80-year-old piece of legislation that was set up to regulate and govern energy in a very, very different time with a really different set of problems and challenges. The system by which we govern and generate, distribute, and consume powers evolved in fits and starts. There's a very heavy state-centric approach to how we regulate energy, as we know. That began to change a little bit in the 1950s when you had more transmission of power across state lines with the development of the ISOs and the RTOs, at least in the east and the western coastal areas. You had.
Oh, sorry, my bad. Go ahead.
You had very recently, really in the last 10 years and even in the last 2 or 3 years, a lot of interesting experimental innovation going on, particularly in the PJM RTO. PJM is the grid operator for 13 states in the mid-Atlantic part of the United States. And that experimentation is really around what we call the movement to the distributed energy resource grid, where we're trying to think beyond centralized generation, transmission, and use of power to an era fast approaching and really impeded only by the lack of sort of progressive regulatory change. In my mind, the technologies are certainly there, and the behaviors are certainly nascent and ready to scale. But they really need regulatory structures that reward compensation models. We have dumped a lot of energy and political energy and money through the federal investment tax credit into the development of renewable energy resources, particularly solar, but of course also wind. What we haven't done as much of is help that grid evolve to handle that new power and how that power is transmitted and used. So that's the risks and opportunities that we're really focused on.
So, Job, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I want to ask you something here for my edification. When you're talking about this evolution, up to this point, the kind of traditional way, let's call it, has worked quite well. It's met the needs of a growing economy. Would you agree or disagree with that?
Well, I mean, at what cost? I mean, I think you have to ask yourself against what benchmark. Certainly, the rolling blackouts in California didn't work so well, and that was obviously part of deregulation. But deregulation being driven by the fact you had too much congestion and not enough cross-state transmission of power. You've had similar things happen across the Midwest and the East in different areas. And in your case, in the case of Montana, you have a vast amount of renewable energy potential there that is largely untapped and won't be tapped until you have regulatory structures and transmission lines that make it economically feasible to do so. So, yes, I think it's worked well. Our federal and state-based energy policies worked well in the construct of the 1930s in terms of guaranteeing universal access to power at affordable rates. I think it's worked less well if you look at congestion, if you look at climate change, and the externalities of fossil fuel production. So I think it really depends on what benchmarks you're using and vantage points.
Okay, we're up against a break, and we hope that you will join us.
You don't have to figure out the energy grid, though. You might not even be full of energy yet, but we want to help you get there. We're going to give you some free coffee from Rocket Coffee by simply calling us at 721-1290. You get your chance to win. First caller wins free coffee, a slab of toast, and your choice of spread at the Rocket Coffee stand, which is in the Garden City Garden Supply right across from the Eastgate Shopping Center. So give us a call, 721-1290. First caller wins.
This is Talkback. 721-1290 is our number. We'd love to hear from you. We did have a winner a minute ago, I assume. Is that right, John? Yes, we didn't have a winner.
No, we can. If you want to give us a call, 721-1290, you can be our winner.
Wow.
It's the first time this has happened.
Let me leave and I'll call in. Okay.
He wants some coffee and toast. All right. So anyway, where were we before?
Well, Joe was describing, a number of different issues, and what we're trying to do is to make this somewhat systematic in terms of helping the audience understand kind of the evolution. What's happened and what got us to this point. And, of course, now what are some of the catalysts for what you were just describing, Job, in terms of what is changing the market out there? And, of course, then what are these challenges? And John was bringing up the point that, hey, in Montana, if there's upgrades that need to be paid for, why do we pay for it? Why should we?
Well, Bob, I think one way to sort of sidestep some of the differences on political perspectives and ideologies is to focus on market-based approaches. And I think really at the heart of this conversation needs to be questions about the market and how to make our market function more effectively in the electricity sector. And the beginning of that really starts with the Federal Power Act, where you had state-based regulation of power within state lines, and you had centralized generation, transmission, distribution, all regulated by that Public Service Commission or Public Utility Commission. And that has done a number of things, the most important of which for, I think, our conversation is it's wedded utilities to their generation assets. They own those generation assets. Their rate of return is guaranteed under law. They can amortize the cost of those assets, but to do that, they've got to dispatch those assets. They've got to use those assets to supply power across the grid. Now, in deregulated markets, in the East and West and different parts of the Midwest, that's become a little more complex and advanced in the sense that you can, as a user, residential or commercial industrial user, you can choose your source of power, and it gets wheeled across the grid that the utility maintains, and you pay the utility for that purpose. But there's a competitive element in terms of where you're actually getting supply, and that introduces some competition between which assets get dispatched. There's kind of a longer conversation about the evolution of how efficient those wholesale markets are functioning, and we can talk about that. But at a basic level, when you move to some sort of deregulated level of supply, you do introduce some competition with those assets. That, however, doesn't solve the problem because you still have the Federal Power Act and the 2005 Energy Act that place these responsibilities on state regulators. The state regulators place these responsibilities on the utilities. So it isn't necessarily that the utilities are stuck in the mud or resisting change, and that, I think, is really inaccurate way of characterizing the situation, although it's sort of a common one you hear. I think it's more about the fact you have a reticence or at least a slowness at the state regulatory level to think about, hey, they have these assets. They're protected by law in terms of return on investment. How can we more efficiently use those generation assets and fit the use of those generation assets into different sources of power that the market provides? So I think it really boils down to how interested are we in making our system more efficient from a market point of view, and in doing so, how can we have a better way of compensating generation assets that allows for a diversity? So it isn't necessarily about plugging a certain kind of generation asset, but it is about allowing different types of generation to contribute to our supply to make our grid more efficient and more resilient.
I wanted to throw something into the mix because it's something we've talked about here locally in Montana, and that's the idea of upgrading the transmission grid connections. For example, connecting grids from the Midwest out to the West Coast is the one that would most involve Montana. Basically allowing us to transport more power down to California and all these other places.
Because we're a basic net energy exporter anyway here in Montana.
The problem being there's a giant row of mountains in between here and there, and it's really expensive to do. And a lot of Montanans are afraid that we're going to get stuck paying the bill to help California bail itself out of an energy crisis. And we wanted to hear your thoughts on transmission grid upgrades and whether or not that's the path that you think the U.S. will take.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a good question, and I think, the time I spent out in Montana, it was fascinating to see both the amount of surplus power you're currently generating as well as your vast potential there, in fossil fuels as well as renewables to generate even more power and export that. There isn't really a whole lot of way around that dilemma, however, in terms of transmission lines. If you're going to develop that power, certainly there's a certain amount of storage. Storage technologies have advanced a lot. I work in the storage, energy storage sector a little bit, at least in the East Coast. The amount of power, though, the surplus that you have there is just not really suitable. Storage is not going to solve that problem for you. You have to have a way to transmission, unless you're going to have an industrial policy that says, look, we're going to export this energy in a different way. We're going to subsidize or encourage the development of industry that requires electricity-intensive production processes, aluminum, or like the Amazon server farms sited along the Columbia River, that sort of thing. In that sense, you're transforming that economic value into something else that can be more easily exported. But other than that, you've got to find a way, if you're interested in doing this, to have these transmission lines sited and financed and built. As to who bears the cost, and that goes back, I think, to the question of how do we make this a more efficient approach. Certainly, it shouldn't be the ratepayers of Montana. They shouldn't be burdened or saddled with the cost of building a line that exports power to another state that has a price point problem, and a congestion problem. But this is where, in my mind, maybe 80 years later, the Great Depression is sort of a long time ago. Maybe some of our approach to state-based regulation is a little atavistic and maybe even a little indulgent. I'm all for the appropriate approach to state-based initiatives and regulatory oversight of things that are really about the state and things happening inside of the state. When you're talking about energy, you're talking about something that is, at least in this instance, in many instances, flowing across state lines. And I think in the East, as I mentioned, with the development of the 1950s onward, these things called regional transmission organizations, RTOs, or sometimes called independent systems operators, ISOs. We have a real patchwork across the country. You've got a handful of these in different places. You've got large parts of the United States that are not part or member of a RTO or ISO. But without an ISO or an RTO, it's a very, very difficult time finding a way to properly allocate the cost.
So, Joe, I apologize. We're going to have to go to a break here, but I'd like to ask a question to kind of go into our next segment, which is when you're talking about this and talking about states and the feds and whoever, give us, when we come back, some of your insights in terms of what it's like to talk to some of the state representatives. Do they line up along lines of Democrats and Republicans in terms of their views about this? How are you reaching these people, providing education and insight, and what type of responses are you getting back in terms of how they view what you've been describing to us?
Then we're going to take a break. We'll be right back. 721-1290 is our number. Bob Seidenschwartz, John King, Peter Christian, the Montana World Affairs Council on the radio. It's Talkback, 721-1290. John King, Peter Christian. We've got Bob Seidenschwartz joining us in studio. Job Henning on the phone with us, literally sitting behind the Capitol building in his car.
Are you flying drones over the Capitol today?
I just stepped out of an energy policy meeting here and just hanging out right between the Supreme Court and the Capitol.
Cool. All right, let's get Dave on the line. Dave, you were on with Job Henning. Go ahead.
Yeah, good morning. You know, everyone agrees the power grid needs to be updated, and it's going to cost a lot of money. The problem for the power companies is that if they raise rates too much to pay for this upgrade too quickly, that they'll actually drive customers away to solar, and as such have to raise rates even more as they lose customers.
Well, I'm not sure everyone is agreed that you need to upgrade the transmission grid.
Well, I would assume you would. I mean,
a lot of people want that, but a lot of people are living just fine on the energy they have, like everybody in Montana.
Right, but some big solar flare from the sun might just wipe out, the system, or disrupt it anyway. I mean, it's an old system, and I assume everyone agrees that it needs to be fixed. They lose about a whole bunch of the electricity just by the long lines and the poor condition of the lines. And it would be advantageous to improve the system.
Well, this might be the one thing that everyone in D.C. agrees on, but I'm pretty sure it's not. Okay. Let's see. I'm pretty sure Joe probably has a pretty good perspective on this.
So, Joe, what do you think about that?
Well, I mean, we have, federally, we've invested a fair amount of money in the grid over the last 8 years with the Smart Grid Initiative. We just had a good look back on that, a 5-year look back on that last October with IPRI, the Industry Association Conference, and down in Charlotte, North Carolina. And I think it's interesting to sort of look at what was done. There was a lot of proverbial low-hanging fruit. So when you think about smart grid investments and updating the grid, it doesn't necessarily need to involve hundreds of billions of dollars. And that's what I think that's the politically smart thing to do. I think there's a lot of political energy behind that idea. I think there's also a fair amount of education that has to take place. And while there are some major investments in transmission lines that could certainly open up renewable generation and make it more competitive as you can export it to higher price markets, that's not necessarily something that has to happen right off the bat. There are a lot of things that can happen in the interim, particularly around distributed generation and storage. I think to the point, Dave, though, of who pays for it and saddling the ratepayers with higher costs, and that is a real problem regardless of what is being done to the grid and regardless kind of how much money is being spent to increase the infrastructural capacities of the grid, because as you have defection from the grid in terms of demand going to other sources of supply or in some cases just becoming more efficient and using less supply, as has progressively happened over the last 20 years very precipitously, or fairly precipitously, you are essentially eroding that supply base and you're eroding that return on investment that utilities have. So I think the question really is kind of unavoidable regardless of where you come down on how much we need to put into grid investments and how soon. The fact of the matter is we've got a business model for utilities that really doesn't work anymore, and we're fighting a rearguard action to keep it alive. It'll probably persist for a couple of years or maybe even a few decades, but probably the more efficient thing to do would be to start a political conversation around how to help that business model evolve to better survive and thrive in the 21st century, where you got a really different set of problems.
Okay. So that is a great jumping off point. What is that model? What would the model look like?
Well, I think there are different ways it could happen. I think the basic idea, though, is you have to have a model that reflects reality. That's a good place to start, right? And the reality is that power is no longer generated in centralized areas. There's not a monopoly on centralized generation, transmission, and distribution. And you need a utility model that reflects that and allows for the fact that other people in other areas are going to be generating electricity and supplying that electricity. There are different ways utilities can evolve away from that centralized, that dominant centralized distribution model. One of which is around the provision of services and the provision of reliability and safety. I mean, those are things that we have almost 200 years of experience in some of our utilities. I was at breakfast with the new CEO of BGE, Baltimore Gas and Electric, in Baltimore yesterday, And, they're celebrating next year. They're celebrating their 200th anniversary, one of the oldest utilities in the United States.
Wow.
They have a wealth and depth of experience in how to run grids in reliable, safe ways. So in my mind, that's a key asset. That's something you could leverage into a new business model. And you have a business model that recognizes the fact your core revenue is no longer going to come from your control over centralized generation, although you may have that. And as a provider of last resort, you're going to provide default service even in competitive markets. But your core value is going to come from reliably transmitting power across those grids. There's a value that you can assign to that. There's a conversation and many conversations about how you derive that value when you talk about distributed energy resources and handling that power coming off of solar grids or solar panels on people's roofs. But it's better to have that conversation now rather than in 10 years.
So when you talk about these dissociated, not centralized sources of energy, are we talking about private solar, private wind, small hydro, all these little different things that could be going on in the state of Montana? And we have talked about this before. And making a policy for the company to say, hey, this actually benefits us to suck this energy into our system. Because right now, most of the companies, they don't like it when you, or they charge you for putting energy in the system.
Well, it's a challenge for them, John.
It's tough,
On multiple fronts, it's a challenge.
And they have problems balancing the amount of energy flow in.
Right.
Okay, we're going to take a break and come back and talk about this. We have 2 lines open if you'd like to visit with Job Henning. I know you've got an opinion on this. We'd love to hear from you. It's 721-1290. We'll be right back. Talk back. 721-1290 is our number. The Montana World Affairs Council on the radio, always bringing you thought-provoking guests. We're talking with Job Henning right now, and of course Bob Seidenschwartz, John King joining us here in studio. So
before the break, I asked you about these independent energy sources, which are talked about a lot in Montana. This is a state with lots of people hiding out from the government, and everybody knows somebody that has a lead storage facility and wants to live off the grid or what have you. Yeah. And I guess my question is, when it comes to it, what is your solution? Is it a federal solution or a state solution, or businesses can just change their business plan solution to incorporate these energy systems into the grid?
Well, I'm not a big fan of big bang solutions. I don't think necessarily politically or technologically or in terms of human behavior there's really a good opportunity for some sort of revolutionary change in energy policy like you had in the 30s. I think the more likely approach, and one that would be more beneficial to everybody concerned, in no small part because it would allow for experimentation, innovation, and market-based outcomes, would be the creation of more ISOs, independent system operators. These are these nonprofit organizations that coordinate wholesale energy markets across state lines regionally within the United States. They're overseen by, to the extent they exist in the area, they're overseen by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, here in Washington, and its subordinate organization, the NERC, the National Energy Reliability Council. And this is not a federalization of energy policy. I mean, we already have those authorities in place. The question is really just about becoming more efficient about pushing out these wholesale markets across the United States. And really, I think that would spur a lot of innovation without any heavy-handed sort of picking of winners and losers.
We got a question here on Facebook from Claire. By the way, if you have questions or comments, you can call us at 721-1290 or post your question on Facebook as well. She says, it's best to get off the grid and become independent and self-sufficient. Its security is as bad when the TSA provides for airport security. What about smart meters that the utilities are connecting? Isn't that more invasion of our privacy? Can't they be hacked? I don't know if you know any of the answers to those questions, but I'll let you have it, Joe.
There you go.
Well, sure. So you have, that was one of the big initiatives of the federal smart grid investment policy you saw over the last 5 years. You had some federal money, but also supplemented by large amounts of state money that was indeed put on the ratepayers in most instances to push out something called AMI, automated metering infrastructure. And this is a digital protocol that in some cases rides across power lines, or more often will ride across a local wireless network that communicates with a digital meter placed on your home or your business. And all that meter is doing is it's taking what was otherwise recorded in an analog fashion, really using technology that was about 100 years old, and translating it into a digital format. So there's no there's not necessarily really any new data being generated. It's just being generated in a way that allows it to be delivered in real time. There are a lot of benefits to that, not the least of which is it allows a utility to pinpoint power outages and voltage regulation challenges very, very quickly. So I think in the rollout that you've seen, particularly in Illinois and different parts of California and in the East, the AMI infrastructure has increased reliability and customer satisfaction. In terms of privacy, that data, of course, as I said, is already available in the possession of the utility. So it's really a question of the immediacy of that data being delivered. And certainly, when you think about life in the 21st century, it's about making sure we have protections in place to protect that data. Given digital privacy challenges we've had in different parts of the economy, everybody knows that just because you have the same data, the fact doesn't necessarily make it make it as safe as it used to be, because it's just easier to hack and disseminate.
Now,
so
Joe,
certainly making sure we have.
I was just going to ask you, Joe. From what I understand about these smart meters is it enables, back in the old days, the meter reader used to come walking down the neighborhood with his little clipboard and look at your gas meter, look at your electric meter, write down what you used. Now with smart meters, they can literally just drive by and scan it with a special device or whatever. So they really, and so the whole idea, from what I understand, is to save money on what they used to do on a manual level. And I think what people are suspicious of is, are they using that as a savings? Are they going to pass those savings along to the consumer eventually? Or is it simply for them to run leaner and meaner and just keep the dough?
Well, that's a good question, and you'd have to ask your public utility commission about that. And actually, I'd like to know that. It's a very good question. I think yes, it's true. AMI has been a fairly expensive investment that has largely been laid on the ratepayers in most states, or largely on the ratepayers. And I don't know, and I don't know how the benefits of that AMI investment will flow back to the ratepayers, but that's certainly something that everybody should watch and take a look at. I think, though, I would hasten to add that utilities, to the extent they've done AMI rollouts, really are just at the beginning of tapping the efficiencies that they can from those digital protocols. Yes, it's true. It has allowed people that used to read meters manually to drive by and pick that meter data up wirelessly, or in some cases, they're just firing a bunch of meter readers and they just pick it up through wireless access points mounted on telephone poles in different neighborhoods. And that certainly saves a certain amount of money, but the much bigger play with the digital data is bringing that smart grid intelligence down to the distribution level and ultimately right into the home. And that's something we're working on with the LinkPad product. If you can integrate the way energy is being priced real time on the grid with how your energy load behind the meter is consuming energy, and to the extent you have some ability to vary that load in response to price signals, you can make the grid a whole lot more efficient, and you can make power a whole lot cheaper for you. So,
you can save money for yourself. Is basically what we're talking about.
So, is this like a digital readout? I could go to my wall and say, "Hey, I'm paying 20 cents a minute here," or what?
Yeah, tell you what, we're going to answer that. We're up against a break. 721-1290. Two lines open. This is fascinating stuff. It would be really cool to be. They call it smart home. It's a smart home technology. Basically, your home through this system is able to figure out. If nobody's home, why are we heating? Why are we keeping lights on? Why? So it basically turn things off and shut things down.
You don't want to cook chicken.
And then and then when people come home, then it fires up again, and you start using the energy. But the way it used to be, you turn the thing on 65 degrees and it's 65 degrees all day, but it doesn't really have to be. So we're going to come right back and talk more about that in a moment. I could use a little energy right now. 721-1290 is our number. John King, Peter Christian. Of course, we've got Bob Seidenschwartz with us from the Montana World Affairs Council on the radio. Joining us, Job Henning. And this is a fascinating discussion. Some of it, a lot of it, is really over my head, but I am, catching the crumbs that are falling from the table.
Well, just think what you just said, though, Peter. You're feeling a little low energy, so your demand has been flat since basically 2008.
Something like that.
So we need to increase Peter's demand here. So go into this question of cause and effect. Joe, which is one of the concepts is as we save more, we actually spend more. And the example you gave off air is that low oil prices lend itself to low gas prices, which in theory should stimulate us taking more trips, having more disposable income. So is this just a part of the evolution of what we tend to do, or do we really truly get more efficiencies that can be measured in very positive ways?
Well, I think what you just meant, what we were just discussing, certainly is a possibility over time. As you reduce the amount of money you're spending on energy, you have more disposable income to spend it on something else, and generally that's desirable from a macroeconomic point of view, as well as your own personal household. You got more money to do things. So I think yes, that's a net gain for everybody as you move to more efficient forms of energy. I think, it's important to note that, I'm not talking about some sort of straight line projection that's going to rapidly move us to that place. What I'm talking about is introducing more transparency and market systems to our current approach to energy to make them more efficient. Now, efficient doesn't necessarily immediately translate into cheaper cost of energy in the household. Efficient means you have a unimpeded relationship between supply and demand, or you reduce the political involvement in how supply and demand are matched, and you more efficiently allow a price signal to determine how much electricity is being generated and how it's being transmitted, stored, and consumed. And those efficiencies over time, maybe immediately, depending on your particular case in a given state or a given rate structure, they may immediately have an effect of lower energy prices. But the bigger point is what we're doing now is not sustainable, and it's not sustainable. I'm not speaking in an environmental context necessarily. I'm speaking in terms of a cost context. We're subsidizing. There's a lot of talk about the federal investment tax credit, and how that subsidizes the explosion of solar and wind, and that's absolutely true. But it isn't fair to isolate the federal subsidies for wind and solar without recognizing we've had enormous subsidies over time for base load and fossil fuels and nuclear. That's just the reality, and that's just the nature of energy in an advanced industrial economy.
Just the payoff for some of those energy sources is much better. That's the compare. As a person that consumes and pays for this junk, I mean, I got to consider the payout of an energy source like nuclear versus the payout of an energy source like wind, which has made very little progress in the last 20 or so years that we've been subsidizing it.
But that's a super hard determination to make without a whole lot of economic data. So yes, at one level on your bill, you can say, that's worked out well. Burning fossil fuels the last 30 years, my price has been more or less stable or declined. But it's really hard to tell why that's the case. I mean, how much have we subsidized those things, and how efficient or inefficient are they, and are they sustainable over a longer period of time? And I think there are a lot of indicators that they aren't, but you don't necessarily have to come down on one side of that argument or another. I think what I'm suggesting is, how can we get around a political approach that transcends different ideological perspectives of sources of energy and energy policy, and focuses more on market efficiencies and being more transparent about what's being subsidized and how. And if we decide that spending, X percent of our total GDP to subsidize low energy is a national policy and a priority, then maybe that's just the appropriate national outcome if we're willing to sustain those public investments over time, and the attendant externalities in terms of climate effects.
What would you do? Do you think it would be an unwise thing to strip subsidies from the federal level? Say, hey, if you want to subsidize, you can, but the feds are going to stop doing this. We think it hampers innovation.
On all fronts.
Yeah. Just say we think it hampers innovation. We'll let those that want to compete at their own level and do what they can.
And risk their own dough.
I think that only makes sense if you're going to do it across the board. So if you're going to pull away all federal subsidies for nuclear generation and fossil fuels and the transport of fossil fuels, then yes, that's a reasonable conversation. That's obviously politically impossible to do or extremely hard to do. My former boss, Admiral Rich Meese, is on the board of Exelon, one of the largest nuclear generation fleet in the United States. So I've been exposed to kind of different questions that nuclear generators like Exelon is wrestling with, and those are real problems. I mean, when you look at the erosion of demand and you look at the subsidies in renewables and what that's done to folks that have invested in nuclear and have these assets, some of which are operating in the negative. And the federal government's actually recognized that recently. DOE has recognized that recently.
Okay,
so those are real problems.
Okay, hold on. We're up against the break. This is the last 1 minute break. We're going to come right back. And a question I want to ask Job is, if he were to have his way and be able to put together policies that he believes will be effective, in 10 years, what would my power bill look like? Like right now, I get a bill from Northwestern Energy. It's got some gas, it's got some electricity, I've got budget billing, I pay it, I'm done. Now, I want to find out from you, if you don't mind, Job, looking into the future a little bit, if you had your way, what would that power bill look like to the average consumer? We'll be right back. Hey, it's Talkback. 721-1290 is our number, and it's the Montana World Affairs Council on the radio. Now, real quickly, we only have like 8 minutes left, or 6 minutes left in the program, Job. So real quickly, answering my question, if you had your way and you could institute some policies that you believe would help the situation you're describing, what would the average residential power bill look like? Would it just be from one company, or would we get an amalgam of things that we're getting from various different energy sources?
Well, I think it would be good if in 10 years you had a situation that maybe mirrored in some ways the evolution of how we receive telecom services. I mean, telecom is different in many respects, of course, but you did have that initial idea of universal service and the federal and state subsidies to support that, some of which continues, of course, for universal service fees. But then you have deregulation, and you have a whole lot of competition that's introduced, and then you have a whole explosion of different Internet protocol-based digital services that really transform how we interact with telecommunications and through telecommunications with other platform-based servers outside of the home. I think energy, ideally, would at least mirror different attributes of that evolution. And in this regard, I think it would be more commonplace to have bills from different providers, depending on what an individual or a commercial industrial user was doing and where the power was coming from and what was the nature of the service.
Okay.
Maybe you have batteries in the home and you're paying for a service that you don't own, but it's really just coming out of your own home.
Sure. Okay, let's get Catherine on the line. Catherine, you're on with Job Henning. Go ahead.
Good morning, Job. It sounds like you're supporting micro companies, local and municipal, rather than vast energy systems that are nationwide. Is that right? Pretty much.
That I'm speaking in support of who? Sorry.
More microsystems, local, municipal, rather than vast energy systems that are nationwide, like a vast infrastructure, ranging from the East Coast to the West Coast.
I'm talking about low-hanging fruit and doing things that are doable, and while some of them involve potential investments in interstate transmission lines, there are just a lot of other things that can happen, a lot of innovation that can happen at a smaller level. So I'm talking about finding ways to introduce market mechanisms that allow that innovation to happen.
Okay, now I wanted to address that. How many attendant policy reversals would be needed in order to get to that point? For instance, tort reform to limit lawsuits that impede innovation in energy development, because that goes on an awful lot. And there's, a vast number of regulations that need to be overturned or modified or at least evaluated that get involved anytime you get involved in the energy industry.
And so, we're going to let you go on that one, Catherine, because we only have 3 minutes left in the program. Go ahead, Job.
Thank you, Catherine. A good question. I think I would just refer back to my comments about the 200-year-old knowledge base we have in the utilities around safety and regulation, safety and reliability. They're very, very good at that as we think about the evolution of their business models and helping them to evolve to be more competitive in a changing marketplace. I think placing those responsibilities on those organizations that have safety and reliability as a core competence and finding ways to compensate them appropriately for those values, I think that's super important. There are no doubt some tort reform elements to making innovation happen or making it easier to attract capital at a micro level, microgrid level. But I think, at a higher level, keeping safety and reliability and security the responsibility of the regulated utility, but also compensating the utility for providing those services or guaranteeing those services, I think that's probably a potentially, rather efficient way to approach this next phase of our electricity market.
Joe, we have exactly 2 minutes left. So if folks want to get more information about what you're doing and how to get involved and get more informed as to what you're talking about, how can they access that information?
Well, they can certainly go to our website, www.gridenergy, one word, .direct, D-I-R-E-C-T, sorry, Grid Energy Direct. And you'll note our name is Grid Energy, so we're not about the end of the grid. We believe in the grid. We believe it's about making the grid more resilient, responsive to a changing way energy is going to be and is being generated and used. The grid is always going to play, or at least in the long-term foreseeable future, going to play a really, really vital role in all that. I think some other resources certainly include the FERC, the FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, lots of very interesting things happening there. You have some really big issues around jurisdictional authorities right now playing out before the Supreme Court, where the FERC has been sued by energy generators in the PJM territory. PJM, it started at Pennsylvania, Jersey, Maryland. PJM in the 1950s now includes 13 states based in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. PJM has an excellent website. They run the largest wholesale energy market in the world. You have regulators and consumers and industry from all over the world that come there on a daily basis to learn about what they're doing. Our software partner was co-founded by Audrey Zibelman, who was the CTO and COO of PJM. So take a look at the PJM website. Also take a look at Audrey's new website. She's now the chairwoman of the New York Public Services Commission, doing lots of great stuff with the REV model, pushing down price signals to the distribution level and incentivizing utilities to access
Joe,
generation.
We are completely out of time. I'm so sorry, but thank you. So we want to have you on again, okay?
Well, my pleasure. Thanks for having me. Interesting, very fascinating topic, and your state's right in the middle of a lot of really important questions.
You got it. Hey, thanks so much for being with us today. All right, take care. Take care. Now, tomorrow, John.
Dr. Joel Wallach will be with us.
Longevity. That's what it's all about.
Longevity.
Longevity. So we'll be with us tomorrow. You join us as well.